You're listening to Power Athlete Radio, a podcast dedicated to empowering your performance every damn day. Join former NFL pro and Power Athlete founder John Welborn as he dissects the greatest minds in strength, conditioning, and more. So whether your goal is to be the hammer, destroy mediocrity, or simply move the dirt, you've come to the right place. Now with the warm-up done, let the gains begin.
We interrupt this episode with a shameless self-promotion. Power Athlete delivers battle-tested performance programming for every kind of athlete. So do you want to go from average Joe to MVP? Then dominate with Field Strong. Get stacked and jacked with Jack Street. Hustle in life and still build muscle with Grindstone. Fear no opponent with Dragon Slayer. Be harder than coffin nails with Hammer. Max out minimal equipment with Lean Enable. Or unlock those newbie gains with Bedrock. Get over to powerathletehq.com/training and choose your 7-day free trial right here, right now. Get lifting, get training, get in shape, all while listening to the rest of this show. So how you doing, Doc?
I'm doing good.
Yeah? Is this your first time in Texas?
Yeah, no, I've been here. My husband is actually from Texas, Houston. Yeah.
Did he go to UT?
He went to Galveston.
Okay.
And University of Texas, for bachelor, and then Galveston for medical school.
Nice. So you're in town to do a couple of podcasts, and we figured we'd suck you in doing Power Athlete Radio.
Hey, yeah, anytime.
I'm always glad to do an in-person one. The Zoom feels so sterile.
Yes, and thank you for helping us with the Malibu Microbiome meeting.
Yeah. So, no, it was good. As for a little bit of transparency, I just saw Dr. Hazan last week out in her clinic in Southern California. So it was neat to come out and see your place and kind of understand the global mission.
Yeah, and you saw how many stool samples we analyze, and it's all real, and we have all these machines, and it's a fun thing.
How did you get your start in this?
It was kind of serendipitous, really. It was a curiosity. I wanted to understand what I did when I did fecal transplant on a patient. So fecal transplant, the process of taking stools from a healthy donor and putting it into an unhealthy.
How did you get into that to begin with? Because, that's a little unconventional.
Yeah. So I was the girl that was doing clinical trials for Pharma. And I was known as the queen of C. diff. So every time there was a clinical trial on C. diff, I would be hired because I was the top enroller for C. diff. And I was doing clinical trials. My buddy, Neil Stolman, who's, a great gastroenterologist, basically in San Francisco said to me, you're doing trials for C. diff, but the treatment is fecal transplant. And I said, Neil, don't make me play with poop, please. And in fact, it was kind of funny because when I was a resident or fellow at University of Florida, he was senior to me and he would take me to posters. And he would show me posters of the microbiome. That was like 30 years ago. And he would say, the future's in sh.t. And I said, don't even go there. My colons need to be pristine for me to do them. So for me to do colonoscopy. And so what happened was there was a doctor that entered one of my clinical trials for a pharmaceutical company. And the clinical trial didn't work. The medication didn't work. We gave him all these antibiotics. We gave him the clinical trial. It didn't work. So I wasn't going to let him die. And so I called Neil and I said, Neil, how do I do this fecal transplant? And he said, you take stools, you put it in a blender, you mix it, put it in the colon, you'll figure it out. So I was like...
That seems pretty cowboy.
Yeah. So I was like, okay, I guess. So I started reading the papers, reading the methods, getting the papers from Dr. Tom Barodi, reading how he did it, because his methods are really meticulous on the papers. And then I figured out my own strategy in a way, because I figured, well, fecal transplant, the microbiome is anaerobic. It doesn't breathe oxygen. So I got to make sure that when I take stools, that I'm not killing the stools, right? So, and then I can't evacuate it. So I got to make sure my patients they're holding it and because they got to implant. So the whole process of how do I implant? How do I succeed? C. diff was very easy, I have to say. And that was the first case that I did was something that was just out of this world. It was like seeing a Martian and knowing there's life on Mars, right? And calling Neil and saying, oh my God, it worked. The guy's alive and his colon is amazing. So he's like, yeah, join the club. So there were a few courageous doctors around the country that took on the methods of Dr. Barodi, that took on what Neil was doing. And then Colleen Kelly came on, and, Paul Fierstead. So many doctors and so many academic centers got curious and said, wait a minute, there's something to this. And so I kept doing clinical trials for C. diff because that's cleaner. I get paid for it by pharmaceutical companies. I got paid for it anyways. But I would always make it that if the clinical trial didn't work, I would do use the money from Pharma to do fecal transplant on these folks. So I would never lose anyone because people would enter the clinical trial. And I always knew fecal transplant was going to be the end. That's what I'm going to do.
So you would use all the drugs, use all their protocols, and when they failed, you'd just do a fecal transplant and fix them.
That's it. And I figured, it was fair because the patient's entering the study. He's trusting me to help him. I'm trying this new drug. If the drug doesn't work, well, then we use the money to do fecal transplant. Because fecal transplant is not cheap. I mean, you have to pay the colonoscopy, you have to pay the surgical center, Beverly Hills. It's not cheap. So, we use the funds to kind of do this. And then little by little started seeing different things. And this one patient was Alzheimer's and he had C. diff. I tried to enter him in a clinical trial for Alzheimer's and he didn't qualify because he was so severe. And then he got pneumonia and then got antibiotics, got C. diff, and then came to me. We used the stool bank. It didn't really work for him. The C. diff was reoccurring. So, and probably because of the transportation, maybe, from where this bank was stored. So
have there been stool banks for a long time? Or is that relatively new?
No, it's relatively new. I'm going to say probably about 2010, 2013 is when the guidance came out from the FDA, the first guidance. So the stool bank, doctors were doing it using spouses. And so that's what happened. When the stool bank, it didn't work, I basically used the wife's poop. And he comes back a month later and he's able to remember things and he's telling me things. And the wife says to me, he's playing golf, which I've never seen. He's feeding himself. So I said, wow, something changed, right, with this fecal transplant. And then I started questioning other doctors that were doing this, and Neil especially. And I called Neil and I said, look, I have a guy whose mini mental status went from like 21 to 29 in 6 months, and he remembers his daughter's date of birth.
Wow.
What happened? And then he basically brought, we started talking as doctors, and then come to realize Colleen Kelly had improved 2 patients with alopecia areata with fecal transplant. Sahil Khanna improved chronic urinary tract infections in patients post-fecal transplant. That all came for C. diff, but they had something else. So little by little, everybody kind of saw different things. And so we came together with that question of what's going on. And here we are. So to answer your question, fecal transplant was really what opened my eyes to the microbiome. There was a company, I don't know if you'll remember, about 10 years ago called Ubiome that was doing stool samples for everybody.
Yeah.
So I started testing using their stools and I realized I didn't have the same results. So to me, and then when I looked at the results, I said, well, what's this bacteria? What does it mean? Bacteroides vulgaris. I've never heard of that in my microbiology textbook. And so there were so many microbes that were in this report that I said to myself, should this be a consumer product, knowing that we don't know what these bugs are?
Yeah.
And the other thing is...
But we still don't know.
We still don't know.
Because as we were going through our stuff, as you were giving me these names, I was Googling them and it was like, could be good, could be bad.
We don't know.
Not really sure.
We don't know.
This episode of Power Athlete Radio is powered by Train Heroic, the most immersive strength training app experience on the market. We've built an online training business by partnering with Train Heroic to deliver all of our world-class training programs like Jack Street, Hammer, Field Strong, and Grindstone. To learn which Power Athlete training program best suits your goals, head to powerathletehq.com/training. And if you're a coach looking to build a business with the best training tech in the business, head to trainheroic.com/powerathletehq. And now back to the show.
And so here we are in this. So basically, I set myself, I was invited to speak at the Microbiome Congress in 2019. It was kind of a weird series of events of how it happened. But the head of the FDA at the time, Matthew Steele, was supposed to speak. And I wanted to go to this conference, but it was only open to like FDA, government, pharma. And so I called Matthew and I said, Matthew, how do I get into this conference? And he said, well, call this guy, because I wanted to attend. And I called the guy, and I had already had the concept of opening Progenobiome. So I said, you know what? I'm going to go in as a CEO of a company, because I really wanted to attend and see what was up and going, right? And I attended, and I called the guy at the conference, and he said, well, you know, we have a spot because Matthew Steele can't speak. Do you want to speak?
You're like, sure, do I?
I'm like, do I? Yeah, of course. So I basically said, what am I going to speak? It's literally 2 weeks before the conference. And I said, what am I going to speak on? So I said, well, I'm going to speak on the problems of the microbiome research under clinical trial veteran, Dr. Sabine Hazan. And so that was my talk. So, and every pharma company that was there, I had worked with. So it was really funny. Series, Vendetta, Videnta. I had worked with all those companies. So I saw them at the meeting, and it was kind of separated into 3 rooms. And I was in one of the rooms, and I said, by the way, I'm going to be talking about C. diff. So of course, all of pharma came to my room. It was standing room only. And what I did was I exposed the microbiome. I exposed the fact that there cannot be a normal in the microbiome, that there cannot be a normal, because 15% of people that have chronic pancreatitis, we don't even know they have chronic pancreatitis. So when you're testing the microbiome, are you testing a person that has chronic pancreatitis and you don't know versus what you're deeming a healthy person? Vice versa, percentage of people have reflux. They don't even know they have reflux. And then you look at the whole diet, vegan, vegetarian, carnivore.
Mediterranean.
Mediterranean.
And they're like religions, which is crazy.
And then you look at the whole world in general and you go, okay, well, the Amazon jungle has this kind of microbiome and South Africa has this kind. How can we compare? How is that a normal? So basically, those were all my questions that I had at the conference. And after that, of course, you saw Ubiome got, they were found to be fraudulent, indicted. It was a big fraud. It was a big Ponzi scheme and fraud. And then from there, I said, well, I guess I'm going to start looking at it, but as a research and as a clinical trial. So I joined forces with the head of the National Institute of Standards, Scott Jackson. And I said, let's start the Malibu Microbiome meeting. And then all those doctors that were doing fecal transplant, Howard Young, that was the head of the NIH on the microbiome. I said, why don't you be the moderator? Why don't we bring all these, N of 1 studies that we're all noticing? And then what you as the NIH are seeing, let's bring it all to the table. Let's expose the world, and let's validate the microbiome, stool testing, which is something that Scott Jackson wanted to do. And has done a fantastic job to at least, get us closer. And then COVID hit. And when COVID hit, we were supposed to have the Malibu Microbiome meeting, March 2020. And then COVID hit. So I was joined with all these people. And so I realized I'm friends with Dr. Barodi. I'm friends with Neil Storm. I'm friends with all these brains. And I have a CRO, clinical research organization that does clinical trials. And I own a genetic sequencing lab that's already accumulated a bunch of stool samples to look at the microbiome and validate it and get us a normalized stool sample testing. And then what happened was when I looked at all that, I said, well, I guess I'm stepping into COVID. And the first intuition really from a paper in China that they found COVID in the stools by PCR. So I sent the paper to Scott and I said, hey, Scott, they're looking, I bet you it's in the stools. So I come back to my lab and I'm looking at this PCR. Remember, PCR is a piece of a microbe. And we're doing whole genome sequencing. In other words, we look at the whole entire microbe, not one copy, but like millions of copies. So what happens is I called my scientist and I said, Andreas, we're switching gears from Crohn's and autism for a bit to look for COVID in the stools. And then that was the beginning. That was the day that we found out, we found 100% of people that had COVID in the stools that had positive PCR. We said, this is the way. And then when we found out a stool sample had COVID in the stools for 45 days, that was early April already. So we had collected stools as soon as COVID hit. Mm-hmm. So as soon as the first few patients in America, I called all my buddies that do clinical trials. And I said, in fact, one of them is very aggressive, Alan Miller in Atlanta. And I said, Alan, you need to go collect stools, send them to my lab. So we were collecting the first stools at the beginning. And so what we saw through the pandemic was really the evolution of this virus. When Delta came, we were still in Delta when they were saying Omicron was here. And here's why, because they were testing the septic. And by the way, Scott Jackson did his own thing of looking at the septic tanks because, he knew the data of COVID in the stools. And when we published, by the way, that data, I sent it to him. I said, by the way, here it is, clinical validation that COVID is in the stools of human patients, not the septic tanks.
Why is that groundbreaking? I mean, wouldn't that just be a natural kind of like assertion that like if you had COVID, it would come out because it's attacking the immune system, it would come through that?
Everybody was saying at the beginning, yes, you're right. I mean, a person that's a critical thinker would say, well, I'm putting something on my skin. It's going to go through the blood vessels. It's going to go to my gut. Of course, it's going to be in the gut, right? The majority of people, and if you remember, the whole narrative was it's a respiratory problem. And so it stays in the respiratory.
But aren't there other respiratory diseases that you can test for in the stool?
Of course.
Okay.
But
all right. I thought I was going crazy.
No, but it's all a narrative. Like if you have influenza in your respiratory, you're going to have it in your gut. Yeah. I mean, it's just, the body doesn't just stay, right? Microbes don't just stay in one area. So if you have them in the bladder, in fact, I had a patient that didn't tell me she had urinary tract infection. She was kind of on the, dementia, beginning of dementia. And I tested her microbiome. Lo and behold, I found 3 microbes that usually you find in the bladder. And here's a patient that has UTIs causing her dementia, not even knowing she had UTIs. So it's all in the gut. The gut tells you.
Wow.
Yeah.
So as that goes on and you present this information and you finding it, and like, how did that step into you being able to kind of formulate treatments or at least start kind of dictating, because it was your research that the Doctors Beyond Borders used? Yeah.
So at the beginning, what happened is when we discovered COVID in the stools, the first thing we discovered is if you took hydroxychloroquine and Z-Pak and vitamin C, D, and zinc, which was my protocol. Well, it wasn't my protocol at the beginning. It was kind of like an offshoot of Dr. Didier Raoul. So there was, Alan Miller, for example, started patients on hydroxychloroquine, Z-Pak, and vitamins and zinc. Okay. And he gave me the stool samples before and after. So when we got those first stool samples before and after, we discovered COVID was in the stools at baseline. And then after the treatment, COVID disappeared. So that was the beginning. So then what happened is we started seeing, but it also the treatment also wipes out the microbiome, right? So the concept and vitamin C, vitamin D came from Italy because they were doing some studies on vitamin D, and then the hospitals. I was calling, remember, I'm a clinical trial doctor, so I always call what's going on. So I called doctors in Italy at the hospital. And I said, what are you using? And they said, well, you won't believe this, but vitamin C IV is working great. So I said, well, maybe that's what we use: hydroxychloroquine, Z-Pak, zinc, and vitamin C and vitamin D. As we started looking at COVID in the stools, we started looking at what are the people that have COVID, what's in the microbiome of people with severe COVID versus people with high-risk exposed COVID. And what we discovered was that people with severe COVID had 0 Bifidobacteria. And people high risk exposed, like myself, I was in front of, patients, they were breathing, they were coughing on me. Why didn't I get their virus? Because my Bifidobacteria was high. It was sustaining me. So, and by the way, I've been following my stools the whole pandemic, right?
Yeah, I never got it either, and I've been exposed hundreds of times.
Yeah. So, and your microbiome protects you, and now we know because you have such diversity. My God, and seeing around where you live, that's where you get the diversity. But basically, that's what we started noticing. So we started noticing there was a difference between the severe COVID and the high-risk exposed never got COVID. And it was this particular bacteria. What we noticed was this bacteria was very sensitive. So if you used a drug like hydroxychloroquine or Z-Pak, it would wipe it out as well. And that's probably why patients have the long haulers or kept on going. So we came up with the formula of vitamin C and vitamin D because we noticed, the first thing that I noticed on the pandemic was really how vitamin C increased the Bifidobacteria. Remember, I was on the front line. I was paranoid of catching COVID. I knew vitamin C IV was the solution. I had been on the front line in Miami, and my go-to is always vitamin C.
Do you take it orally or in
orally?
Is there a certain amount that you can take orally?
Well, I was taking a lot because I was exposed and I was worried. But then what I realized was when I tested my sample, my scientist calls me and he goes, did you notice your vitamin C? Did you notice your Bifidobacteria went up 4 times the level? What have you been doing? I go, I've been taking high dosages of vitamin C. And then he said to me, well, you got to look into vitamin C. So right away, I switched my gears. As I'm dealing with treating COVID patients, as I'm looking at the stools before, in high risk and severe, I switched my gears and I said, okay, we need to call a bunch of naturopaths and send us patients before and after. So I started making phone calls again and said, I'll pay for stool samples before and after on patients with vitamin C. And then we had like 20, 25 samples, and we noticed that the vitamin C increased Bifidobacteria. We published on that because actually vitamin C increases Bifidobacteria in vitro. So we published the paper to show that it increased, in patients. So that was the first thing. And then, as time went on, noticed Ivermectin. I was writing the protocol so Dr. Barodi and I partnered. We created a company, Topelia Therapeutics, Topelia for white dove, for peace, because we felt like we were on a war zone.
Sure.
And so he tried to raise money. He got, killed in the media for trying to raise money for a pharma product for COVID. So, and basically bias. So when I saw that, I said, you know what? We cannot bias the research. Let's just forget about bringing a product. Mm-hmm. Let's just show the research the way it is. Because otherwise, if you show people you're making money from the research, then you're biased and you're trying to sell them something. So I wanted the research to be as pure as possible. And so what happened, and it's difficult to do that because why are you sponsoring a research if you're not going to make money from it, right? Because that's the business model of pharma to begin with, right? So
why aren't more people suspicious of big pharma? When you guys did it, you got attacked in the media, but yet that's just big pharma's.
I have no idea.
Okay.
I have no idea. It's almost like brainwashed. Yes, big pharma can pay the journals to publish the data. They can, pay for the meeting to, get the doctors to write the drug. They can take doctors to the restaurant to write the drugs and influence. They can advertise in the media and influence. And yet we say nothing about that. That's totally okay, right? So I think there has to be a time where we basically say, okay, look, your discovery, you discovered this, you should definitely make money from your discovery. This is a discovery. As long as it's reproducible, there's nothing wrong with that. So, basically, from there, we started noticing ivermectin increases this bacteria within 24 hours. And so Dr. Barodi was on the ivermectin doxycycline zinc protocol that I started writing and submitted to the FDA as I was running the hydroxy Z-Pak, vitamin C, D, and zinc. So through that manipulation of microbes, if you want to call it, and seeing the before and after of the microbiome, seeing what happens with ivermectin, seeing what happens with hydroxy, seeing what happens with vitamin D, seeing what happens with zinc, seeing what happens with vitamin C, you kind of develop kind of a recipe, right? And you all of a sudden learn how to treat patients. You start categorizing, you start separating your patients and saying, okay, you know, I'm going to put my patient that's the most severe, that's not breathing, I'm going to attack it quickly because he probably doesn't have bifidobacteria. So I'm going to give him hydroxy and Z-Pak right away to stop the virus from multiplying. And then I'm going to use high dosages of vitamin C, D, zinc, ivermectin to increase the microbiome so that we can increase the bifidobacteria to rebuild that immunity, right? So the whole concept was really that. It was kill the virus first and then improve the microbiome. And where did I learn that? From C. diff. So C. diff, what do you do when you treat C. diff? You take vancomycin or Flagyl, an antibiotic, you give it to the patient for 10 days. And then what you do is you essentially kill the bacteria. But you run a chance that it might come back and you didn't kill it completely. So what do you do when you do fecal transplant? You add more microbes to suffocate whatever is left of that microbe, right? So in other words, you're not killing it, you're suffocating it. You're adding diversity to the desolate gut that has become empty because you've killed it with antibiotics, right? So with COVID, it was the same thing in my mind. It was kill the virus as soon as possible, build the microbiome, build the immunity, build the microbiome without having to do fecal transplant, right? And then little by little, we started realizing, well, what does vitamin B do to the microbiome? What does vitamin E do to the microbiome? What does magnesium do to the microbiome? What does cumin? What does honey? What does all these things that we know to be good for us? How are they good? What are they feeding? And so it really became, it's funny because I coined the term refloralization.
Yeah.
And at the beginning, it was a better word for fecal transplant. I just hated the term fecal transplant. Alex Kurots, who's an amazing gastroenterologist at University of Minnesota, calls it microbiota implant. And basically, he's right, because it's microbes that we're transplanting. It's not poop. It's not feces, right? Because there's a process to removing the feces and keeping the microbes in there. And that's what he does in his stool bank.
So you take the stool samples, the fecal matter, and then it's kind of, I guess, filtered through.
Yes.
Where you're kind of isolating.
And you just basically extract the microbes, and you make sure that they're good microbes and not.
I kind of imagined it was a lot more archaic than that. They just like took poop and smeared it in there.
So that's how we do it. That's how we did it as gastroenterologists. We just took the poop, blended. We didn't care about the foods and all that. We've come along. These stool banks have come a long way in processing. Alex does a fantastic job. He screens his donors. He's amazing at that. I think this is definitely the path for people that don't have a donor. But sometimes you have and that's where freedom of choice, in my opinion. If, let's say, you are dying and you have C. diff and you want fecal transplant, well, we're going to call it microbiota transplant, and you want your son's poop instead of, some stranger you've never met, that should be allowed. And I think,
well, how do you match that? Like, is there some algorithm that you put together where you put in, you see which one's missing, and
we've created kind of an algorithm at Progenobiome to see what's one missing, what's one overgrown, etc. But what I was saying is the process of fecal transplant to, microbiota transplant to refloralization. To me, refloralization is really using what we have to grow those microbes naturally, not having to resort to someone else's poop, right? How do you grow a garden without having to transplant, new plants? Maybe you could just remove the weeds, put the seeds, let it grow, put the fertilizer, right? So that's what I'm trying to do, really. I'm trying to understand these microbes a little bit better it's a huge undertaking because you have to understand the microbiome of the planet. You have to understand what Africa looks like, what Asia looks like, what Canada, America looks like, etc. Then you have to look at people that are drinkers versus non-drinkers, people that are eating certain foods versus non-other foods, medications. So it's a huge undertaking. And then from there...
So nothing exists in a vacuum.
Nothing. So
we're influenced by environment, the people we're around, the foods we eat,
yes,
the air. You think about all the environmental toxins, medicines, genetic history, exposure. I mean, you're talking about
everything,
infinite amount of variables.
And our brain also, impacts us, tells, us how we're going to feel that day. So it's all, yes, it's very complex. So when you start looking at all these therapeutics, you try things. So you have to be courageous enough to try something. And you have to say, is this safe for my patient to try, right? To me, when I started with ivermectin, because Dr. Brody said to me, doxycycline and ivermectin was our protocol, and zinc, right? Well, zinc is very safe. Ivermectin, my sister did the first clinical trial on lice and scabies, where she basically treated thousands of kids, babies with scabies with ivermectin. She was the first one. And in fact, if you Google Dr. Sabine Hazan, you're going to see her name. And there's an interview with her trying to recruit kids. She had like 5 different sites all over the country. So she
Here
was
in the U.S.?
In the U.S., yeah. So she had Vegas, she had Orange County, New York, Miami.
Are scabies and lice a big problem these days?
Oh, it's a big problem. Yeah. So
I remember as a kid, we used to have to do lice tests. They would pick through our hair.
Lice, yes. Well, lice is a big problem. I mean, in Malibu, we've got. I'm always the doctor that's inspecting all the heads, and we have the lice fairies. I only remember
one kid ever getting pulled out for having lice.
Wow.
And then we just made fun of him forever.
So about 25 years ago, 20 years ago in Malibu, there was a lice outbreak at the school. And ivermectin was not available, but I was the person that was testing every kid before they go back to class.
What was ivermectin originally developed for? I know the deal with river vilas.
It's an antiparasitic. So it's essentially it was for parasites. It was for gut parasites. Then they discovered there's other purposes to it, and lice and scabies was another one. So during COVID, when Dr. Brody said to me, "Start using ivermectin," I said, "Well, it's safe enough." I mean, why did I use hydroxy and Z-Pak? Because we give Z-Pak for every cold out there.
Sure.
We give hydroxychloroquine to thousands of arthritic patients. All of a sudden, it's a dangerous drug. And then ivermectin, we gave it to millions of people around the world. All of a sudden, it's a bad drug for dying patients. I mean, it's not like I'm giving it to every single patient. I'm giving it to the dying patient whose oxygen is in the 70s, right?
Sure.
And then I noticed that it increased the oxygen saturation. That was a breakthrough that was never talked about. And Jackie Stone in Africa was the first one really to see it, where she basically treated these hypoxic patients with oxygens in their 50s, 60s, and they're improved. And Dr. Brody called me because he was in contact with her and said, "You've got to give it at high dose." Because I was doing the hydroxy, Z-Pak, vitamin C, D, and zinc protocol. And I was blinded. So I didn't know whether the patient got the real stuff or the placebo. Mm-hmm. So I'm freaking out one day because one diabetic, renal failure patient is crashing. His oxygen drops in the 60s. And I'm giving him, I don't know whether to give him hydroxychloroquine because he had hydroxychloroquine potentially. I was blinded. I didn't know. So I said, you know what? Let me give him ivermectin. So I wrote the prescription for ivermectin doxycycline. I told him to go to the pharmacy and pick it up on the way to the hospital and pick up French fries because it has to be given with a fatty meal. And so he picked up his French fries. He's eating. And he arrives at the hospital's oxygen is 92%. And that was what And by the way, I was watching this guy the whole time because, I'm responsible essentially. So I was watching this guy the whole time. And then next thing you know, I'm seeing oxygen in the 70s, then 80s. And then he gets to the hospital at 92. And I said, wow, something is happening. Wow. And that's where we're at.
What, I remember when COVID hit, the deaths in Italy and kind of like that part of the world seemed just incredible. Yes. Like it was just people were peeling out, and I didn't know if they were like older people that were tourists that just happened to be in Italy when this thing struck. But I felt like by the time it came to America, it had diminished a little bit. Like that was truly whatever the worst version of COVID was.
Yeah,
like
viruses weaken, right, with time. They come out strong and then they weaken and then they disappear. If you look at, the last few viruses we've had, they last up to 15 years. A virus doesn't really disappear right away. You just don't hear about it, but it just weakens its power. So they come on strong, and then with multiple mutations, they kind of weaken. And that's the difference between a virus and a bacteria, right? The virus constantly mutates and then weakens. The bacteria has a potential of mutating, but it also has properties that remove that mutation, that it recognizes its own mutation and clears it out. So bacteria is actually a lot smarter than a virus, if you think about it. Although one would say the virus probably adapts and survives by constantly mutating, right? So the world of microbes is really fascinating when you see the difference between a small, tiny virus that's, 20 times smaller than a bacteria and a bacteria that just stands there. And the fact that they both have the potential to kill a human is just fascinating to me.
Or help. I mean, like with
or
the
help.
Bifidobacteria.
Yeah. Or help. Yeah, absolutely.
It's
a war. It's really a war between microbes.
With the Bifidobacteria, what is the function for Bifidobacteria? And more importantly, is there a point where like there could be too much Bifidobacteria?
So we're looking into that because the question becomes, if you have too much Bifidobacteria at a certain age, is that bad for you, right? Does that cause problems on its own, right? So we're looking at specifically glioblastoma, because what we noticed with a couple patients with glioblastoma is they had really, really high Bifidobacteria. So you have to ask the questions, is Bifidobacteria a good bug up to a certain point and up to a certain age? So those are the questions that we have. What is Bifidobacteria? Well, it's supposed to help break down sugar. Mm-hmm. So if you cannot break down sugar, how are you going to get sugar into the cells? So we all talk about mitochondria, and I heard a podcast this morning and someone was saying, ovaries and eggs have a lot more mitochondria than anything else. And yeah, it's great, but where's the sugar that makes that mitochondria work? How is it going without the microbes? You have to start at the beginning, in my opinion.
Yeah.
So the beginning, life starts with microbes. And we have to start acknowledging that. And we have to start acknowledging that life starts with microbes and life ends with microbes. We're born with microbes that make us who we are, and then we acquire other microbes that change our personality, that make us focus, not focus, etc. And then as we die, the process of aging, these microbes take over the body in the gut, decompose us and put us back into the ground. That's their function.
So like take me through the, like almost like the cradle to grave, right? So a baby is born,
Yes.
Majority of babies come, the exact same way, right? They come
Yes.
through the birth canal unless they're C-sections.
Correct.
And in that moment, they're first exposed to bacteria from the mother and then obviously the parents. And so there's kind of this collaborative effort. With the gut diversity, you're inheriting all of this from your parents and in your environment. So would it make sense that, parents that are healthy, that have healthy guts and high diversity and Bifidobacteria hand that over to their kids,
Correct.
Whereas people that are more broken hand over
Correct.
less?
Correct. So a baby's born, they're this new vessel, we'll put it that way, and they get microbes from mom as they're in the womb, right? Development of microbes. They get DNA, right, from mom and dad. So you give half and mom gives half. And then mom holds the baby, dad holds the baby. You're starting to give microbes, right? And mom breastfeeds, mom gives good microbes to the baby. And therefore, when grandma comes and touches the baby, grandma has like some not so great microbes because she's an aging microbiome. And she may have an infection, a virus, she's giving it to the baby. The baby's resilient because of the high bifidobacteria. The process of aging is really that high bifidobacteria. We discovered that in the lab when COVID hit, because the first thing that I said to myself was, what's the difference between, why are babies surviving? If you'll remember, I think one kid died with COVID.
Yeah, but I think he had leukemia.
Yeah, and he was overweight, and there were all these things,
there
right?
were all these like
and then they made a whole big, chaos, drama, news about it.
Well,
but
I mean,
the kids,
old people die, but kids start dying. That's when people start like setting houses on fire and going wild. Correct.
But if you look at the kids around, the schools, etc., they were fine. I mean, my kid, I was not going to let her homebound, I mean, it was just crazy keeping these kids in-house. So you had to let them go out and expose themselves. The kids, for the most parts, were fine because they had a lot of bifidobacteria. The newborns were fine because they had a lot of bifidobacteria. What really shocked me during the pandemic, and I said that on Epoch Times, was really the fact that I discovered that a few moms were vaccinated during the pregnancy and the babies had zero bifidobacteria.
Oh, we're vaccinated for COVID.
For COVID. And then the babies had zero bifidobacteria.
Did the mothers have no bifidobacteria?
I didn't test the mom. I tested the babies. But some moms, yes. Some moms I tested had zero bifidobacteria.
So you would assume if the baby had none, the mother had none to give?
Well, that's the hypothesis, right? Obviously, we need to see more moms, more babies. Why are some moms that got the vaccines fine and the baby was fine, and their bifidobacteria was fine? So, but to me,
would it have to do with gut diversity and bifidobacteria being high? So like the more robust and resilient you are, the better you can weather these storms?
So those are good questions. I don't know, maybe. So maybe there's a resilience that's part of your DNA. I don't know. I mean, there's so many. When I think it's important to look at the data. I think it's important to look at, why is it happening for this one and not this one? Because that's really where the magic is, right? When I looked at severe COVID versus high risk, I saw the difference was bifidobacteria and diversity and high bacteroides, etc. So, there is definitely a signature that happens between those two categories and those two newborns. But I will tell you, like, we are following babies whose moms were vaccinated and whose bifidobacteria didn't climb up. And some of them are heading into that spectrum autism condition. So, and that's why I started looking at autism as well. I mean, I started looking at autism before COVID, but I actually got into the whole looking at the vaccines and et cetera because of COVID, because of autism, et cetera. So, but autism is loss of bifidobacteria.
So, but autism is kind of, and I think in one of your talks, you talked about it being in the gut, but also being in the brain. And there was kind of a dominance.
Yes. So autism is interesting because autism, is either, in my opinion, is either a microbiome first or a brain first. Brain triggering the gut or gut triggering the brain. I think it's important to fix both sides. I think it's important to also see the connection. There's some kids that come up to me, to my lab, and we test their microbiome, and they have exact same copy of microbiome as their twin sister, for example, right? And the twin sister is neurotypical and the kid is not, okay? So those people that have a normal microbiome and they're matched to their twin sisters, and the twin sister is normal or I should say neurotypical, and then the autistic kid is autistic. Those kids, I have to say, something happened to either the connection to the brain or the brain itself, because I don't see a difference between the two microbiome, between the two twins. Okay.
So do you test them to be neurodivergent kind of?
Yeah. So I test. So when we have kids, when I do treatment with autism, and what I do is I test the sibling that's neurotypical. I test the mom and dad to see what do they look like, and I test the kid. And so I have this family portrait, if you want to put it that way. And then I say, okay, well, it seems like mom was overgrowing this microbe, and therefore this microbe is present in the kid with autism. But then the second kid doesn't have that microbe. She's the perfect candidate for this kid. Now, if I don't have a family and I just have one kid, then that kid is perfect for the stool bank, right? Which is Dr. Adams' protocol, which is essentially, bringing stool donors to give to those kids. And that's going to be the future, to see if that reverses the kids. I had an amazing breakthrough case with autism, and it was identical twins with autism.
Both had autism.
Both had autism, identical, nonverbal, aggressive. And basically, I looked at their microbiome. And remember, this is trillions of microbes that are basically isolated, right? And what we noticed was identical microbes elevated in both twins, and the same exact microbes missing in both twins when you compare to the mom. Okay.
All right. So we have 10 times more microbes in the body than cells. Right. So we're just basically this microbacteria.
Reservoir.
Yeah.
Yes.
How many different variations are there? Because I know when we were going through my gut, there was kind of a almost like a gray thing where you were like, we don't know what these are.
Yeah. There's
how many are there?
So there are. So when you look at the microbiome, it's trillions of microbes, and if you look at the 0.001% is what we know. The rest is all gray zone.
Well, it's like
there's
22,000 genes that they've identified.
Right.
But it's an infinite amount. So then if you can't map it.
Well, you can map to a certain level by looking at that sliver, right? So if in that sliver you see a dysbiosis, an imbalance, you see more relative abundance of one microbe, and you see it in both twins, right?
Yeah.
You can say almost with certainty, yes, these are the microbes that are causing the problem in these two twins, right? And then you look at what they're missing. Now, what you do when you do therapeutics or restoring the gut, and not with poop, with these kids, we did something else.
Yeah.
But when you focus on killing those three groups of microbes and growing the good stuff with combination therapy, then what you see is a complete flip of the microbes. And you see the good ones are really high now, and the bad ones are gone. When that happens, and you look at the kids and they're fully verbal, and by the way, those kids are fully verbal now and reading every single book.
So they were nonverbal.
Nonverbal, aggressive.
Did you treat them with fecal transplants? Or
I'm
was
not going to say how I treat
Okay.
it right now, because I want to make it as a breakthrough, and we have to work with the FDA.
I get it.
Because, unfortunately, at the beginning of the pandemic, I stepped into COVID and in full.
And you stepped into shit.
I stepped into shit completely.
Yeah.
But, in full transparency, I wrote those protocols to save as many lives.
Like the Twitter stuff. I mean, I couldn't believe how, I don't know who controls these individuals, but the amount of attack on your Twitter blew my fucking mind. And I'm
Yes.
you are a published clinical researcher
Yes.
with a CV that's multiple pages, work for the drug companies. I mean, and they were
Yes.
treating you like you were a tinfoil hat, Alex, what's his name? The guy here.
Berenson?
No.
Alex Jones.
Yeah.
Alex Jones.
Like Alex Jones.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I know.
And I remember when I clicked on your X on your Twitter, and I was like, you got to be kidding me. This is.
I mean, if anybody should have talked, it was me. Here I am on the front line taking care of patients. And the whole thing and the whole joke about all this was, And I said that on one of the podcasts at the beginning. I said, you know what really bothers me is those people who are not touching patients, who are not treating patients, reading papers, and they're giving advice.
Yeah.
It's like saying, go read a book on how to sail a boat and then go take the most expensive sailboat and go into the oceans and start sailing.
I deal with this. I had people trying to argue with me about how to train athletes in football and all this. And you're like, no, I did this job. And on top of it, I train these guys to do this job, and they've all done very well. So it's pretty interesting when these like individuals that have no basis to be able to have these conversations want to wade into this thing with experts, and because they, have nothing to do better, and it seems ridiculous to me.
And to me, what was so funny is, why can't we have a discussion? I mean, Are you
trying to have a nuanced discussion on the internet that's actually fruitful and ends in a positive way? I don't think it exists.
And why can't we bring those that are so pro a narrative with those that are so against it to talk about it, right? That's when I knew there was something wrong. To me during the pandemic was, why am I censored? Why can't I advertise for clinical trials? I've been doing advertisement. I would do an ad on Facebook for psoriasis and I would get like 1,000 patients. Why can't, in the midst of a pandemic where people are dying, why can't I advertise on Instagram or Facebook? Right?
Do you think it had to do with the emergency rider on like the vaccine, where if there was nothing on the shelves that could potentially treat this, what's that called? Emergency use access.
Yeah. And absolutely, if treatment worked, the vaccine could not come out.
Yeah.
And there was too much that was put into the vaccine, too much hope, too much everything that was put on. And again, we're not saying the vaccine didn't work. We're saying, look, we should have allowed both.
Yeah.
Maybe that's when you say, okay, forget the emergency use access. Let's allow the treatment. Let's turn off the fire.
What about allowing people to get their stool tested to see if whether or not that they should or shouldn't get it done?
Well, the stool testing came out after the fact. So it was basically, stool testing was kind of a discovery. I don't think we're there yet with the stool testing, because unfortunately, this is what happens with stool testing. Patients, doctors don't have the knowledge yet of what all these microbes are doing. My fear is, you look at a microbe that's overgrown, you think it's overgrown, and you go, I'm going to kill it. So now you're killing a microbe that could have possibly helped you with calcium absorption, right? So it's important.
Well, I mean, it feels like every one of these microbes has a function, and that could be 10 to the order of every magnet. Like there's no way to be. And I think what's confusing for a lot of people is they want everything kind of in a vacuum. Oh, this does this,
right?
And it's like a 1-to-1, but it doesn't feel like that.
And everybody wants that pill. Someone says to me, why don't you create the Hazen pill? No, there's no such thing.
What would the Hazen pill be?
I guess a diversified microbiome.
Well, how does somebody move from like let's say somebody has a diversity score of like 4 or 5,
right?
Like how much can they improve, and how far could you move them?
And how much should they improve to, right?
And what's
Maybe
a good score?
Some people cannot go up to a 7, right? Or an 8. So diversity is important, but good diversity. You don't want to have diversity of just bad bugs. So diversity is important. But up to what level? And up to what level in this city, for example? So, for example, if I take a stool microbiome of the Amazon jungle, right, which is fully diversified, and I give it to a New Yorker who has a microbiome that's been diluted over generations of being in New York,
what would happen?
I don't know. Probably kill the person.
They just fall over dead.
I worry about that, right? Because essentially you're giving microbes that this person has never been exposed to, and you're just going, diverse microbe. So it's very tricky.
So Victor Hugo is one of my guys from Brazil. He's from Fortaleza, which is in the north.
Yes.
And he's getting married. So they want to do a bachelor party of a fishing trip in the Amazon.
Oh, nice.
So we've been talking about that. So going to Manaus and then like getting on the boat and going on this fishing trip. And so,
well, you'll be perfectly fine there.
I'm going. And it was as we were talking about it, because Shanji and these guys are all obviously from Brazil. He's from Manaus in the Amazon. And they were like, oh, it's going to be great. And I'm thinking to myself, I'm like, man, I hope this is like the true test for me and my microbiome if I can go to the Amazon and survive.
You're going to be fine.
Okay.
You're going to be fine. In fact, I want to test your stools after you come back from the Amazon.
Well, that would be interesting.
Yeah, because then we'll see what changed.
Yeah. Man.
I went for my best. It's so funny because I've traveled the whole pandemic and I tested my stools the whole pandemic. And I went to Zimbabwe. I saw the changes of my microbiome in Zimbabwe. I saw the changes when I went to Singapore. I saw the changes in Italy. My best microbiome was when I was in Italy.
Really?
So, and I think probably because I have ancestors, I'm 1/3 Italian. So I think that's probably was my food, my comfort zone. So, yeah.
Do you feel that certain parts of the world are more microbiome diverse and healthier places to live?
I think what I think is certain places have certain microbiomes that are for that population that lives in that area. So think of that person that lives generations from Venezuela. They're going to be embedded with the microbiome of Venezuela. So therefore, and what happens is when you change from Venezuela to China, for example, your body takes a change. It has to adapt. So it's really an adaptation. And that's why you see people that go from Mexico to China and they get sick, or China to Mexico, they get sick. It's that adaptation because you're used to a certain environment, a certain group of microbes, and then you move to another. And are you going to survive or are you not going to survive, right? Are you going to adapt slowly? And I think there's methods of adapting as well that probably in the future, that's going to be the next route of how do you move safely from one area to another and adapt to that area.
Is there, when we originally got connected, one of the questions I had to do with I always believed that there was a perfect human diet. Yes. And actually, after meeting you and talking to you, there is no such thing as a perfect human diet. It's the one that you're most adapted to.
Right.
So that's kind of what we run into a lot, especially in the fitness performance training space where, you have to eat this way, you have to eat this way. Right. And these people are so dogmatic and it's so hard-lined and this is who I am and this is their identity.
Right.
And because this works for me, then I have to port this out to the world. And if you're not doing this, then there's
Right.
That seems so myopic. I mean, that feels just like the dumbest thing on the planet. And but what are some things that individuals could kind of hang their hat on? Is it a high protein diet, one of diversity, one of this, or is it just comes down to we don't know unless we test you?
I think, the future is going to be, we don't know until we test you. I think that's what it's going to come down to. But also I think, I think people know what is their comfort foods. When you go from eating ketogenic diet to all of a sudden you're incorporating bread and pasta and you're starting to have gas symptoms and you're feeling miserable, you're altering your microbiome. So you have to go back to that diet that you were on, right? So I think the gut is very interesting because it warns you. It warns you of the disease 20 years before. Think about Parkinson's. Parkinson's warns you that you're going to have Parkinson's from the constipation that starts 20 years prior. So, your gut, if something's off.
Wait, say that again. So that people that have constipation, Parkinson's
could be in their future. Could be in their future.
Is that because their body's not clearing the toxins?
It's probably because they have an overgrowth of a certain microbe that creates that constipation, but also they're probably retaining good microbes is my thought process, okay? So when you look at people with Parkinson's and you take their history, they'll tell you, I've had constipation for 20 years. Mm-hmm. So it started 20 years prior, or they'll have, I can't smell, doc. I've never really been able to smell. What does that tell you? They probably have some viruses going around, right? That they've lost the sense of smell, right? So again, a microbiome issue, right? Because when we, and these are just purely coincidental, cases, when you correct the microbiome of Parkinson's. And there's going to be a lot of studies coming on with Parkinson's and fecal transplant. I know Dr. Dutta, John Hopkins has done some great studies. There's some studies in China that have shown, improvement of Parkinson's with fecal transplant. We're not there yet. We got to be more precise of the donor, what kind of stools, etc. But there is definitely, at Progenic Biome, we're seeing a signature microbiome with Parkinson's. So can we correct that signature microbiome with Parkinson's? And when you do correct it in those N of 1, N of 2 patients, the first thing that they tell you is my bowel movements are better, or I regain my sense of smell, which is fascinating because what did you do? You just altered their microbiome, and all of a sudden they can smell. Something is happening when you change the microbiome. So this is the future. We need to step into this. So there's a lot. It's, I'm right here. I'm at, full speed ahead in the research. Everybody's kind of here still raising money and funds. And I just jumped into it and it's been fun.
How do we take the politics out of science and rebuild some trust in research, especially when there's something as polarizing as COVID, autism? Right. I mean, even talking to people, I talked to a guy yesterday and, I've been doing all these annual consults. And as we kind of got into talking a little bit, he asked me about the podcast we did. And I told him I was doing this one today. And one of the topics we were going to talk about was autism. Sure. And as soon as I said, he got kind of quiet. And then he's like, my son was diagnosed with autism.
Wow.
And he actually found jujitsu, and that was like opened him up, and now he's become very competitive.
Oh,
and he's actually improved.
Amazing.
And I was all I could think of, and I, obviously I'm nobody to be able to make these observations, but I wonder if like his interaction with healthy individuals help his microbiome, because he said when he started doing jiu-jitsu at like the age of 6 and now he's 15, he's better than he's ever been.
And probably mom changed his diet too. These moms are warriors. They read everything, they look at everything, they try everything. So I'm sure something changed, that mom did or dad, and got him to decrease the level of bacteria that was in his gut. And then when he started focusing on the new tool and being with other kids, he kind of started becoming like those kids. But I mean, just as I mentioned it, like you could hear people or when you start talking about COVID, all of a sudden people get like so polarized because it was such a... Well, that's what they did, right? They censored, and if they censored and they also shadow banned and they blacklist and they called you all sorts of things. I mean, you can't believe the stuff that was put on me on Facebook when I advertised for COVID.
Oh, I saw.
Yeah. So
it's wild.
So to me, I had to, I'm coming up and I basically say it like it is and I don't care. And I just, I kind of put on my big girl armor in the morning and I wake up and I don't let anybody stop me from my research. And you've probably seen me on X where I showcase some studies that validate my work. And then I say, you can mock me, you can criticize me, but what you cannot do is stop me. Yeah. And it's who I was born to do this. God trained me. God put all these roadblocks in my life to basically toughen me up and to become a warrior. And, being a warrior is really what I teach my patients too. That resilience is something you acquire. Yes, I could sit in my bed and think about my back pain, knee pain, whatever. Or I could say, I'm waking up in the morning because humanity is going to go extinct if I don't step in. Right? Because think about my work. When at the beginning, when we saw the politics, my staff and I, Ginger, especially my lab manager, she said, are you sure you really want to step into this? I mean, look at who's, criticizing your studies. This is political. You're getting involved with the politics and the government. And I said, well, if not me, who? Are we supposed to just follow one hypothesis? What if they're wrong? Humanity is dead. Yeah. And so I was ready to die on the front line. I was ready. I said to myself, I would expose myself to COVID. I learned so much. I learned how to become resilient. I learned not to be scared of a virus. I learned that hey, this is a learning experience. I'm here to learn. I'm here on the planet at this moment in time to learn about the microbiome. And why wouldn't people want to hear? Why wouldn't people want? I mean, microbes are going to take over your body when you die.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't you want to understand so you could live a little bit longer? I don't care if you're the guy governing the world or the guy dividing or polarizing. You still want to know because you're human.
And you're going to die as well.
You're going to die as well.
Yeah.
Don't you want to stay living a little bit longer? When people quote to me like,
I don't know. I think we'd be better if those people expired earlier.
well, or maybe we change their microbiome
and then make them healthier and friendlier.
Make them healthier. I'm all for making the enemy healthier. I think the enemy needs good poop. So
So is there any way that we can rebuild this trust? Or do you think that at this point, like the average consumer is just so mistrusting of big pharma and everything that they kind of lump it all in, that it all feels like this, Operation Warp Speed? I mean, just as you remember, Trump's Operation Warp Speed, we got to get the vaccine in. And you had Democrats that are like, I will not take this. I will liberals. If Donald Trump's in charge of this thing, I'm not taking it. The minute he leaves and Biden comes in, all of a sudden they became the poster boys. They couldn't line up fast enough with their kids and this, and I'm going to be in here. And it was like, you're a terrible person if you don't do this. And I'm like, didn't you guys just say that you weren't going to take this a few months ago? But that's how fast the narrative flipped.
And that shows you the influence of politicians, that they're
media
and the media. But also the media to empower these people to guide the narrative one way or another, to divide us. Because if they divide us, then they can sell us, right? Then it's marketing. Think about it. Polarizing personalities are very looked at, right? I mean, Trump is being talked about both sides. Yeah. As long as they talk about him, he's still alive because he's promoting marketing, right? It's a machine of marketing. So, and same thing on both sides of the politics. So it's really a narrative, and we have to start realizing that it's a narrative, and the consumer has to realize that it's a narrative, and the consumer has to start thinking, what am I being sold here? What am I being told? What am I being like right now you hear of these enteroviruses and everybody's freaking out, or the next pandemic, everybody's freaking out because it's, the Pavlov dog response. You've been zapped a few times and then eventually you remove your paw because you're so scared of what's coming next. So they've gotten people to this level where you just say virus and they're like, I don't want to go back to that. I don't even want to talk about it. I don't want to go back to talking about COVID. So I think the trust is gone. The trust is definitely gone for me. It's going to take me a long time to retrust pharma again. I will tell you the companies that I'm trusting right now are the companies of pharma that are coming to me for vaccine studies and are saying, hey, doc, we want to test the microbiome before the vaccine, before and after. I'm like, yes, thank you. Thank you. I will support you. I will shout it from the top of the roof. And here's what I do with these companies, which is what I've done with pharma all my life. If the product is not great, we help them to make the product great, right? Because ultimately we're not here to destroy pharma. Pharma is much needed because they are the distribution of drugs, right? And they employ millions of people, right? I mean, from and they support, associations, American College of Gastro, there's tons of people sponsoring. So we need these companies to be good and to survive so that they continue to pay the education, so they continue to pay the associations, etc. But at the same time, we have to stop the abuse. And the abuse is stop the advertisement. We don't need to hear about a drug constantly, on the radio, because then you get branded and then the patient comes to the doctor and says, why haven't you given me this drug? Now, the doctor read all the studies, is not really convinced of the drug. That's why he didn't give it to the patient.
Do people go to the doctor and ask for the drugs?
100%. That's what happened at the beginning of biologics. They started advertising on biologics. Think about the guy who was seeing his doctor, was getting a bunch of pills, was in remission. But now he's being told he needs to have an injection every month, okay? how does the doctor convince the patient you're going to switch from these pills to an injection once a month? The only reason that it got to be convincing is because advertising. Live a free life of inflammatory bowel disease with these biologics, right? And then from there, the patient came and said, doctor, why aren't you giving me Remicade? I saw it on the news that it's doing great. And by the way, Remicade is great and was great for that time where science was stuck and where we needed the next product, right? But what if something comes along that's even better than Remicade, right? Are we going to stop the research, censor the research because Remicade now is, no longer is being, the price of that stock is diminishing? And that's what happens right now. And I said that at Senator Johnson's Congress. When he asked me, he said, who's responsible for all that? I said, the problem is pharma is captured by venture capitalists. Yeah. The media is captured by venture capitalists. The research organizations are bought by venture capitalists. I mean, there is not, clinical trial sites are bought by venture capitalists that are supposed to do the research. So now imagine you've got the venture capitalist here, and he's basically controlling the media, controlling pharma, controlling the clinical trial site, and he can play the price of the stock any way he wants. So if a drug is promising for inflammatory bowel disease, but it competes with a drug that's making $10,000 and the price of that stock is $400, well, guess what? This drug will never stand to see the light. And so I don't think people understand that what you do when you invest in all these companies is you make them powerful and they control all that. So, we got to stop that. We got to stop the advertising, and we got to let science be science in order for trust to come back again. And I think, ultimately the patients are the consumer. And if the patients stop being the consumer and demand of their government better, demand of the government to do what they're supposed to do in monitoring the drug safety, we would be better off. But we need to start seeing, and we have people now in command at the NIH and FDA that I'm hopeful anyways, that that's going to turn a bit. But we also, it's all in the leadership. And as long as that leadership does not get biased by money and stays righteous, that's all we care about.
Are we going to make America healthy again?
I think we're going to make America healthy again because of people like you that are basically out there speaking and telling the truth. And there's thousands of people like you that are out there speaking, telling their friends, telling other friends. Word of mouth PR is the biggest PR. Yeah. At the end of the day, that mom whose 2 kids went from nonverbal to being verbal, she's on every autism platforms on Facebook, and they're trashing me like crazy. And she's out there saying, absolutely not. She knows what she's doing, and I'm following her, and I trust her. And by the way, at the end of the day, it's interesting because it is a patient-doctor relationship. And it's so important to develop that relationship with your doctor. We live in a world where they're trying to remove the doctors and put AI in replacement.
I heard Bill Gates saying that we, in 10 years, we won't need doctors, we won't need lawyers, we won't need accountants, we won't need anybody. And my whole thing is, what are we going to do with all these people?
Yeah, exactly.
He's making these grandiose claims.
Yes.
And I'm has anybody asked him, being like, okay, so let's say you've trained your whole life as an accountant in 10 years. Like, what happens to that individual? He doesn't get to be an accountant anymore?
Right. Or the pathologist or the
radiologist now.
Radiology and pathology are obsolete now. I mean, AI can probably take over pathology and radiology. Thank God there's invasive radiology and there's invasive pathology, but I still think, there is a role to the mind. And I think we need to preserve that patient-doctor relationship because I don't want AI to tell me what disease I have based on my symptoms. And I certainly don't want AI telling me what drugs I need to take in the future. I don't want AI as my doctor.
Yeah,
So,
I've read enough of AI and this to know that it's never accurate. I mean, at this point, they're like, oh, it's going to get exponentially better, but I still want I don't want to get in a car that's self-driving, those AI cars that are driving around. Yeah. I want a driver.
Yes,
I want somebody that's behind the wheel. So just basically handing it over to a machine. Like I want no part of that.
Yeah, and freedom of choice. There's those people that will want it. Great, go for it. But those people that don't want it and want to ride their horses themselves, yeah, this is what life is all about, preserving our freedoms to choose what we want to do.
I want to kind of switch gears a little bit into like longevity.
Yes.
And like performance, because at the end of the day, I really think that like the next frontier of this is, individuals for longevity, performance, and just looking to live their best life.
Yes.
And what's cool is that you can use this vehicle, let's say, to be able to do all the altruistic things that you're doing on the backside.
Yes.
So like how might treatments like fecal transplants help us build resilience, slow aging, and support a longer, healthier life?
So I think all that is basically still very, very new. We don't know. There's a concept that the microbiome ages. If we reverse the microbiome, do we slow down aging? That's the future. That's definitely something I want to see. What I saw with fecal transplant with the gentleman that I did fecal transplant for Alzheimer's is he got a new start in life in remembering again. So did that give him a reset? This is what we want to see, So that's the future. But there is definitely, you've seen the studies where they showed that there's a group of microbes that are present in athletes that the rest don't have. So are athletes creating their own microbes that are becoming resilient because they're training constantly at such a high level of precision, right? So yeah, I think so. I think they're developing their own resilience. And that's going to be the future, to capture that microbe and see if that microbe does something to a non-athlete, right? You've heard of the studies of the fat mice to the skinny mice, sure, right? And we did our own studies with mice where we basically gave skinny mice some soy. And then we noticed they started gaining weight, and we saw the change in the microbiome of the mice from skinny to fat. There were studies that were done that showed basically if you transplant stools from a skinny mouse to a fat mouse, the fat mouse becomes skinny and vice versa. So, but in adults, it's not been reproduced yet. So, that's going to be probably the future.
So would you say that like age is a determining factor for the health of the biome? Like, for example, like let's say you had a kid and you match them with like an older adult and you were to do a fecal transplant. Is there the assumption that the outcome would not be as good as if you took a kid and gave it to, let's say, an adult?
So I'm very selective on my fecal transplant in that if I'm using a kid, if I'm trying to change the microbiome of a kid, I will not give an older person's microbiome because I don't know, right? I don't know. Am I changing the longevity of that kid by changing the microbes? I don't know. So to me, instinctively, I would say probably not. But, that's just me.
Yeah.
So, and I'm very, very meticulous in my work in the sense that I'm very careful to do no harm first because I just don't know.
It's a Hippocratic oath, right?
Yeah. And I'll tell you, people come to me every day, all day, for different things, right? So like I have a kid with irritable bowel syndrome. The parents want me to do fecal transplant on them. So fecal transplant or refloralization or microbiota transplant is really only approved for C. diff. Mm. This country has said very clearly, only if you have recurring C. diff can you do the procedure, okay? So the problem is kids come in, parents want to do it, so they will go to Germany, they will go to Bahamas, they will go all over the place. The problem with those places is they're not really testing the engraftment process. Did it catch on? Did the stools have certain microbes? We're presenting in Vegas on Friday data that shows there's a signature microbiome in bipolar disorder. So, remember, these donors are going to these stool banks. They want to make $500. So they're basically going to give the stools and they're going to sign this questionnaire and say, no, I don't travel. No, I don't use drugs. No, I don't use alcohol. Give me my $500 and bam, right? So these patients are, could be bipolar. They could be suicidal. I mean, a lot of them are like high achieving kids that are very, very driven and have psychological.
Is it fair to say that if you were to take, let's say, the microbiome of those individuals that had bipolar and you were to do a fecal transplant in a healthy individual, that they would gain these? Theoretically gain these.
That's so if you look at the data of fecal transplant, there's actually data that shows that, the donors, if the donors were anxious, the recipient was anxious and there was an anxiety. And actually we published a signature microbiome in anxiety. So anxiety itself is transferable from the microbiome. So, yes, so it's possible that you could get bipolar disorder. I mean, I corrected a guy who had C. diff, a urinary tract infection, psoriasis, and suicidal. And I gave him an English professor, stools from University of Minnesota, who was like perfectly Zen yoga instructor. And basically the guy became non-suicidal, C. diff resolved, chronic UTI resolved, and his psoriasis resolved. I mean, and we showed it, like that was engrafted. He matched the donor to a T compared to what was the baseline. So yeah, I think that's the danger part of fecal transplant. And why I stepped into this myself is because I realized that pharma was heading into that direction. My job is to make sure that if they're giving the stools, to tell them, hey, maybe you don't want to give this stool sample because you're running a risk of having bipolar disorder in your clients in the future. Because we need a dictionary of what all these and this is how complex this is. This is like writing the dictionary. I'm essentially writing the dictionary of all these bugs. Autism is not a one bug.
Oh, you mean this just doesn't exist in a vacuum like everything else?
No. So autism is multiple bugs that can cause, microbes that can cause autism, right? And it's a signature really. And then same thing with Parkinson, same thing with Alzheimer's. So we really have to define better the good bugs, the bad bugs, the good bugs up to what level, the bad bugs up to what level. And we're just not there yet.
Is it, okay, so like let's say somebody has gut dysbiosis, I think is what you call it, and like they have low diversity in this. It seems amazing that you can go and give a healthy individual, and just that fecal transplant ends up almost doing this, like, I don't know, beyond Thunderdome, where like the more beneficial one will take over and not vice versa. Like it's almost like the healthier one is more dominant. So that just by implanting it, now all of a sudden it takes on those characteristics. Like for example, if you did the opposite, if somebody was healthy and you were to do a fecal transplant with like somebody that was broken, would they not even notice it? Would their gut just be able to process it out and it wouldn't influence them?
I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know.
Because it feels like, two men enter, one man kind of leave where.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely.
Believe inherently that the body wants to be healthy. And that when you have things that are making the body unhealthy and you remove them, I think the body responds very quickly. And my thought was that if somebody had an unhealthy gut and you were to do a fecal transplant with a healthy individual, that would become dominant. And the vice versa, if like you were a healthy individual and you got like, let's say a lesser transplant of like microbiome or fecal transplant, that the body would fight that off because it was not as good as what it had.
Yeah, I think that would be an interesting experiment to do. But unfortunately, I don't think it's going to pass an ethics committee where you give bad microbes to a healthy individual. But I will tell you which population we could observe is the jails, the criminals. What happens when you have people going in with a certain microbiome and then they're basically collaborating together what happens to that microbiome, right? Does it rehabilitate? Does it change? And then the other thing is nursing homes. What happens in the nursing home situation or an assisted living situation where you have an elderly person that's exposed to other folks that are not so alert, right?
Do you think that when they go into those homes that are kind of like when you're around other people that aren't as cognitively with it, that they kind of
start mimicking being? I mean, you see people that live longer are usually parents that live with their children. And they're happier and they're with it and they're focused, etc. But once the mind starts going and the desire to live, let's put it that way, it goes away, I think microbes penetrate, in my opinion. I think the mind controls so much of our bodies, and you see it in the elderly folks. An elderly person that just lost his will to live. He doesn't have a purpose. He doesn't have a job, right? All of a sudden, he deteriorates because what is he doing all day? He's watching TV, he's eating, sleeping, swimming, whatever it takes. But it's kind of this habitual, rhythm that happens. And yes, they're alive, but eventually no matter if you change their microbiomes, you're not going to change them because they've lost that will to live, I think.
They're just waiting around to die.
Yeah, so that's why I kind of embarked in the microbiome. I'm going to be busy for a long time. So
it feels like it's endless. I mean, is there ever a expectation that we will be able to map the microbiome?
I think so. I don't think it's in my lifetime. Maybe it will be. That's why I'm kind of speeding up through it. And that's why every time somebody blocks me or retracts my papers, it's really frustrating because it slows me down. And then I say, I don't want to do anything anymore. Forget it.
Fuck these people.
I don't need to share my knowledge. And I was on a podcast the other day and the guy started with, one of my hypotheses that was retracted. And I said, a hypothesis should never be retracted. And he said, well, the data you presented was not right because the data was retracted after my paper was published. And I said, it doesn't matter. It's a hypothesis. I can quote anything in a hypothesis. It's my hypothesis. And he went that route instead of going into the constructive and what
seems very adversarial.
Yeah, very, very adversarial. And I knew right away he was probably paid to put me on stage to kill me and to kill my narrative and whatever. And I said, you know what? So I went ballistic on him. And I said, let me ask you, what's a good bug? I was like, what's a good bug? What's a bad bug? How does a probiotic stick to the colon? How do you stick microbes in the colon? I just went off with all these questions. And I go, if you can't answer that, then probably you want to stop interfering with my research because I have some of those answers. But if I can't publish, I'm not going to publish those answers. And ultimately, what you saw during the pandemic was a revolution that happened because of protocols that were suppressed. Mm-hmm. The more they suppress, the more they light it up on fire, right? If they had said, people should be free to take hydroxychloroquine, ivermectin.
Nobody would have taken it.
Nobody would have even paid attention. There would have been no media exposure on that, right?
Diet, exercise, and sunlight.
Yeah, what happened to that?
Yeah, those are
vitamins.
The three.
Vitamins. What happened to that?
Yeah, direct
nutrition.
Sunlight. Yeah. Like the fact that there's an entire market of infrared red light therapies.
Right.
Which they're just mimicking the things in the sun. So I mean, it's
crazy. And here's the thing that woke me up during the pandemic was I live in Malibu, as you know, and the mayor of Malibu said, stop going to the beach during COVID. And the whole time, in my mind, I was, salt is a killer of microbes, right? Salt water is probably the best thing for viruses. And then next thing you know, the sun is the best thing, vitamin D. Yeah. No, we couldn't go to the beach. You had to stay in these boxes. That's what happened. That's how the trust went off. And then they said, the shot just stays in the deltoid. That was, again, why are you lying? So many lies. When that happens, trust goes away.
Well, I mean, and then you have Rachel Maddox out there going, you get the shot, it stops it. It's
Yes,
it's
yes.
a done thing. You can't spread it. I mean, she like threw such a stake on the ground.
And
then
how does she sleep at night? That's what I want to know.
I don't think she does. It's usually upside down like a vampire because I believe that that these people are not good people. And,
yeah, I mean, how do when you? I mean, I can understand getting paid to say something, but at the same time, you have to have some kind of values. You have to have some kind of conscience.
I don't think they do. And it goes back. I love the old kind of term like trust your gut.
Yes.
Because it feels like we know instinctively, and actually learning more and more about the gut as we become, friends and just like more, educating me as much as I can. Like, in your gut's pretty smart.
Oh yeah.
And when something like, it sounds like bullshit, like something doesn't feel right, like inherently.
Yes.
But I wonder if a lot of people, because their guts aren't as resilient, because their guts are broken, don't have the same wherewithal.
Probably. I mean, I think that's probably what's happening is that they're not in tuned with their gut, right? And maybe that critical thinking is just a microbiome, that's different than someone that's not a critical thinker, someone that follows somebody. Think about it, it's so easy to create a sheep mentality to follow, I mean, like with fear, they made you scared of a virus. I was skiing last week and doing these moguls.
Nice. Where'd you go?
Park City.
Nice.
And the whole time I was skiing, it boggled my mind. And the whole pandemic, I've been going skiing, during winter at least a couple of times. And every time, I remember in 2021 when I was skiing, I remember asking myself, how do people ski moguls and yet are not afraid of skiing the moguls, but they're afraid of a virus? I mean, I'm more afraid of the moguls than the virus, So they made us afraid of a tiny virus that basically, but it took courage to kind of realize. And we did see all those people dying, and it was not a hoax, etc. But here's the thing. At the same time, we needed to have courage. Yeah. And when we had courage, I remember the first time I took an airplane without a mask. And I said, oh my God, I'm going to catch COVID. No, didn't do it.
But I mean, a virus is 1,000 times smaller than the smallest hole that you can see.
Right.
So, I mean, up in my shop, I weld and I wear
the big mask.
Well, yes. But I wear like the N5 mask.
Yes.
The amount of dust and metal in my mouth and nose, and I've known that forever. So the fact that I was like, this isn't going to stop anything.
Right.
I wear this when I grind metal, and I still have metal in my nose and my mouth.
And by the way, that's amazing that you're a welder and your diversity is so amazing. I wonder if welders have a good diversity. We should test. We should do a study.
Well, I mean, I'm very fortunate to kind of live out here on this piece of property.
Of course. So you go from in and out, and you're wearing a mask.
But we were here during COVID, so we didn't wear masks. And we were like, when we were, I guess, sequestered in, as you want to call it, like we still lived here.
Right.
And like everything was available to us. So we were outside. It just was that the kids didn't go to school.
Yeah. No, but your environment and the whole, the horses around, etc. That's your diversity. That's what's keeping you diverse.
So if you could optimize the microbiome, like as like the next frontier in performance enhancement for athletes and people, like is it really something that we could profile these top athletes, be able to get their stools, look at their microbiome, and then potentially either mimic or kind of understand why they are the way they are, and then be able to use that for longevity and performance? Like, is that the next performance enhancing?
Yes, I think that's the next. Studying these athletes, seeing what they're doing, seeing how their microbiome is changing with the performance. And then that's going to be the gold. That's going to be figuring out, what makes them different to improve others. I think that's the future.
Well, there's two ways to do it, right?
And also testing to see if they're possibly good donors, right? Because maybe their microbiome is is great that could help someone else, right? So
so there's two ways to influence it, right?
Yes.
You can do the fecal transplant, which feels like almost like dropping like an atom bomb or like a nuclear weapon on the middle.
Sure.
But is there a way to take somebody who's maybe not going to do the fecal, that's like, broken or missing things, and kind of take them on a journey to create greater diversity?
That's what I'm basically doing. So that's what we discovered with the bovine. Remember when we did the bovine immunoglobulins,
Sure.
which is blood of the cow spun and it's that clear liquid. When we give the bovine, that we increased the Bifidobacteria, we decreased the Bacteroides, which is your bacteria that's increased in anxiety. We increased the Firmicutes, which is microbes that help with calcium absorption, vitamin B absorption, etc. And then we decreased the Proteobacteria. So that formula, if you have as a patient with an autoimmune process, that formula in your microbiome, essentially bovine immunoglobulins can help you. So yes, there are products that you can use to manipulate the microbiome to mimic that athletic or that high performance, right? But we're at the beginning of all this, I think. So, there's also diet. What are the athletes eating versus the regular person? You have to kind of mimic that diet as well.
Most professional athletes
carnivore
have some of the worst diets I've ever been
Oh,
around.
really?
Yeah, I mean, I played with the guys in the NFL that ate McDonald's for every meal.
That's interesting. Okay,
there's a guy named DJ Metcalf who's a phenomenal player. Eats once a day.
Wow.
Eats gummies and sweets like Starburst gummy things.
Yes,
Drinks a coffee,
yes.
drinks that, and then has one meal about 9 o'clock.
Okay,
Eats 4 bags of candy, a coffee, and then eats a meal, and that's it.
Okay, so that's a resilient microbiome. And I tell
so he's succeeding in spite.
He's succeeding in spite, because people tell me, oh, you have to eat healthy and you have to do all this stuff. Like, I always listen to people that are basically talking about, all sorts of foods, right?
Yeah.
And some of my best donors have the worst diet. Nachos, French fries, gummy bears, garbage. So what does that tell me? That tells me their microbiome is so resilient that whatever you're giving them, it's going to go through them. Doesn't matter. They're not absorbing it. They're not getting it in their body. It doesn't impact or touch their body. That's almost the best microbiome to have in a way. So the person that's sterile, that's eating the clean food, the clean diet, has not been exposed to the outside, right? So it's kind of like the person that stays inside all clean. Now you can live with a clean gut, clean microbes, clean everything. But once you deviate from that clean gut, clean everything, you're going to get sick because you've not been exposed to the diversity. Diversity is key. Being exposed, surviving. Think about what I did during the pandemic. I exposed myself to thousands of strains of COVID.
By traveling the world
by traveling the world, by seeing patients, by analyzing stool samples. Every time I analyze a stool sample or I collect stools, and sometimes I do collect it myself. I went to Zimbabwe. I collected stools from the elephants and the lions and all that, just to see what is in the microbiome of the elephant that makes it vegan, what is in the microbiome of the lion that makes it a carnivore, right? And so what we noticed with the animals is really a signature microbiome that's specific to the lion, that's specific to the cows, I've tested the cows also, by the way. So I think as we discover more and more, we're going to start mapping this microbiome that you're saying, and then eventually we're going to discover the resilience, because the resilience is the key. So how did I survive the pandemic, right? How did I survive going to Zimbabwe and not wearing a mask? How did I survive going to Singapore? How did I survive, what did I do to alter my microbiome to make it resilient so that the next time I'm exposed to a virus, I know how to intercept it quickly and survive. I'm not removing myself from it. I'm going full front of it to see, how do I survive this? And if it affects me, if I get a virus, a GI virus or whatever, then my body knows how to respond to it quickly to survive and bounce back up, right? So it's a warrior mentality, right? That you have to take on. It's like what does the athlete do? As an athlete, you're trained to basically survive, to do the next run faster and faster and faster. What are you doing when you do that? You're training your body to become, a machine in a way.
So, you're creating strength and resilience.
Yes.
And I feel like
same thing with the microbiome.
If you stress your body in that way, there was years ago, I think it was the book Lifespan. What's his name? David? No, it's not. Yeah, I think it's David Sinclair. Wrote a book called Lifespan. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I looked for in there is I've always been curious why things like a sauna or let's say cold plunge or some of these things, like why they create, positive gene expression and resilience. And he had a really good point in there. He said, anytime you can put your body in a position where you think like I'm going to die, then what happens is you get positive gene expression. So you get into a sauna and you're in there at 200 degrees and you get that moment where you're like, I got to get out here. I'm going to die. If you don't do that, then the body doesn't have positive gene expression. If you just lay on the couch all day, the body's like, we got to get rid of this dude, and you'll get negative gene expression to kill you off sooner.
Right.
So I think it's
a training. So you could do that with so what I've learned from me anyway, survival is really shocking the microbiome. It's like you damage it, you expose it. It recognizes a microbe. And then you get rid of it, you survive, right? So it's the same thing as bodybuilding, right? Yeah. You're building up the muscle and you're tearing up fibers to create muscles, right?
It's forcing adaptation.
100%.
Like muscle's just an adaptation for strength and for building these things. And it's a forced adaptation that the body does not willingly want to do because it's extremely expensive and hard to handle.
Yeah. And it's hard. It's hard to get there, right? So, I mean, I sat on my chair the whole pandemic and saw so many patients and, was doing so many Zooms, et cetera, that I gained like 40 pounds during the pandemic. And it's so hard to lose that weight, but you have to get back at the gym. You have to retrain. You have to recondition yourself. And it's the same thing. It's readapting to heart rate at a certain level of 120, right? To get to that maximum power. And it's rebuilding the muscles. And that's really survival, right? So you have to have the brain convincing you to get back to the gym. You have to get that willpower. I heard Joe Rogan hates going into the cold plunge, but he does it every morning. And it forces him to ignite, essentially.
So what's weird is I've heard him say how much he hates it. I'm very indifferent about the cold water. Like I can get in there. And,
oh, really?
Yeah, it doesn't even raise my level of anxiety. I get in and I have zero emotional. Like he was talking about it, like he was getting ready to go have a heavyweight fight. I get in with no emotion and it doesn't do anything for me.
Wow.
So yeah, I did it 30 days in a row at like 34 degrees.
Wow.
And it just doesn't, but
maybe
I also.
It's because your diversity.
Well, I
think it comes back to your diversity.
I grew up in Southern California. We used to go surfing, I grew up in Palos Verdes.
So you're used to.
Yeah, so I was used to the cold and then we got in cold tubs. I played in some of the colder games in NFL. So like cold and extreme temperature doesn't really bother me.
I actually prefer the cold to the heat personally. Yeah. So
I wanted to do just like a quick, like little kind of like speed round with some of the things that are in the media right now. Methylene blue.
Not a fan. So I just think it probably affects the microbiome. We've seen it. We've seen patients. We have a study coming out on methylene blue. But here's the thing. If you have a damaged microbiome or you're about to fly and you need it for whatever, you're going to adapt to needing it constantly. It's not anything that the body needs is not necessarily a good idea, right? So the only thing the body should need is water, sun, nutrition, vitamins, rest, sleep. That's it. Peace. That's what the body needs. Yeah. If you start, needing, people say to me, oh, well, ivermectin and this and that. No, if you need a pharmaceutical drug to survive, you're not resilient. Yeah. Okay. I mean that you're not a good donor for me anyways. So personally, if you need anything, that's not a good idea. So I'm not a fan of methylene blue.
Okay. What about probiotics? Because they're everywhere. Like they're
Yes.
in the refrigerated, like they're on the shelf. They're
They're
here.
in the drinks. They say they're in the drinks.
Yeah,
but
there's
they're not.
Kombucha and this and
Yes,
probiotic,
yes.
and then there's my kids were drinking these soda drinks that are
The probiotic drinks.
these sodas like probiotics.
So we tested 26 products, as you know, on the market, and only 3 of them had probiotics in them, bifidobacteria in them. The others didn't. So the majority of drinks on the market do not even have it. It's just garbage. It's a marketing tool they're using. And there's no control of that, by the way. Nobody is controlling this because it's a business. You know, they sell, who's going to check it, right? The probiotics, even the probiotics on the counters, like the brands of the pharmacy, etc., typically 16 out of 17 don't even have bifidobacteria in there. And then you have to ask yourself, is the one that has bifidobacteria, is it alive or dead? So, and what I do with my patients, and they usually tell me, well, I'm on probiotics. Should I stop taking my probiotics? I go, no, absolutely not. Let's see if I can see bifidobacteria in your stools. And 9 out of 10, I don't. They come in with 0 bifidobacteria. So I tell the patients, I go, well, you either killed your bifidobacteria with these probiotics that were meant to help you because they're not really good probiotics, or you're basically not taking the right probiotics and there's no bifidobacteria in that probiotic. So, you know, that's my theory. You got to be very careful. And also, here's the thing. Probiotics alone are not going to do it. It's a combination therapy. Here's what I tell all my patients. If you have a house that's burning and you're pouring gasoline and water, the house is going to burn to the ground. You're never going to turn off that fire because you're pouring gasoline and water. So if I'm taking probiotics and I'm drinking my glass of tequila 3 times a day, well, I'm pouring gasoline and I'm killing the bacteria. So it's not going to work. So there's so many foods that we don't realize what we're eating that are killing the microbiome, that are killing the bifidobacteria. So if you think that a yogurt is going to bring you back to health or probiotics is going to bring you back to health, no, it's not going to happen.
What foods would you say destroy bifidobacteria?
We can't, right now I'm not even going to say because we're still testing.
Sure.
Like we're doing actually an amazing study. So if there's people that want to, participate, we have till May and it's free. The company, it's Manuka honey.
Oh.
We're testing Manuka honey before and after. So, so we'll know. Is it improving the bifido? Is it decreasing? Is it improving the proteobacteria, decreasing the proteobacteria? So we need to see. So we're going to be having that study being done. We have a couple of other natural products that we're testing, natural foods. We're testing cumin before and after to see, is it improving? Is it decreasing? Is it an anti-inflammatory because it's increasing the bifido or killing? So that's those are the studies we're doing.
What was one other thing?
And then the other thing about probiotics that I was going to tell you, the mind controls the body. So if your mind is somewhere and is stressed and is anxious and you have a lot of issues going on, it doesn't matter that you're taking a probiotic if you cannot control the lifestyle, the stressors in your life. That's very, very important.
Alkaline water.
I hate alkaline water. I like alkaline water for patients with cancer because, there's some data that maybe it might help cancer patients. I like it for patients with gout. It can help decrease the inflammation. I don't like it because as you're eating foods that, strawberries that is picked from the fields or blueberries that is picked from the fields, from the time the strawberry or the blueberry has reached your kitchen counter, 20 hands and have passed on and touched it, you count on the acidity in your stomach to neutralize those microbes, right? So if at the same time that you're eating those blueberries, you're drinking a glass of alkaline water, you're not letting your stomach do what it's supposed to do at a high to create acidity. And also you mess up your whole, acidity pH. Think about when you're putting a ton of alkaline water, now your kidneys have to function a lot faster to maintain the homeostasis, and your lungs have to breathe faster to maintain the homeostasis. So it's never a good idea to drink something. You know, our stomachs are created at a certain level, and especially as we get older, our stomachs are not secreting as much acidity. So if on top of that you add alkaline water to it, now you're allowing microbes to pass. And then you have all these people that are taking also proton pump inhibitors. So you've got proton pump inhibitors and alkaline water, and loss of pH from the parietal cells that are decreasing with aging. That's a disaster. And that's probably why the aging process speeds up in all these folks, and infection rate goes up in all these folks, and then they, microbes take over. Yeah.
If you could had a time machine and you could go back in time 100 years and take stool samples in comparison to
today. I wish
I
could go back to Noah's Ark.
Well, I mean, or even 1,000 years ago. If, and I know this is a theoretical, like you can't really answer this, but I'm sure that like in your mind, you've probably formulated this. If you could go back in time and take those stool samples and bring them, what do you think the changes would be? Or more importantly, like what could we learn from that? I mean, you think about.
I think we've lost diversity. I think we probably had a ton of microbes on the planet, and slowly, the microbial pool is diminished. So
what's the highest diversity score you've ever seen?
11.
11.
Yeah. So but I think there's probably think about Noah's Ark. Okay. So it's kind of funny because to me, the whole pandemic, I kept thinking, now I know why Noah built his ark. 2 by 2 animals.
Well, I always think that there were 2 penguins that had to swim from Antarctica to get there.
Oh, that's funny. That's funny. But here he is living in an ark with a bunch of animals, and he's said to have lived for hundreds of years, right?
Yeah.
So you wonder if the exposure of all these microbes of animals maybe allowed him to live longer, right? So if I could go back 100 years, I'd love to test the microbiome, but I'd love to test the microbiome even in tombstones, and, just to see what did the pharaoh's microbiome look like. They were said to be very tiny bone structure, tiny. Was there a difference in microbial, genus back then, or species back then that changed? Did the microbes change over time? Yeah. I mean, that fascinates me even more.
Well, I mean, think about the level of cleanliness. Like I think we were talking about like polio, for example, like it was the feces in the water that was causing the transmission of polio. I mean, all of a sudden we fixed, the indoor plumbing, and we weren't draining into lakes in the same way. And all of a sudden polio became kind of a non-factor.
And here's the thing. We've gone from that cleanliness to over cleanliness. And I think that's the problem. So
think about the hand sanitizer at COVID.
Yes.
Like anywhere you went, people are squirting that stuff everywhere. And I was like, I want no part of that stuff.
Right. I think it was about maintaining the balance. I think it's about the exposure. You look at, people always tell me, quote me, scientists of the past, right? And I look at how old were they when they died. And you realize, wait a minute, this person died young. Why would I listen to someone that died young? I'm going to listen to the person that lived to 96, right? Yeah. So I follow when I started looking at all the microbiome, etc., I went to Dr. Sidney Feingold, who wrote the book on anaerobic infections, okay? And I said, Dr. Feingold, what am I seeing when I'm seeing a patient? I'm giving stools from the wife to the husband, and the husband starts remembering his daughter's date of birth. And he said to me, you're seeing the microbiome in action, and you're seeing this microbe. And he gave me this paper. He said, put it in a safe. When you have your own lab, you're going to see what I'm showing you, okay? He ended up dying of Alzheimer's, interestingly enough, but he died at 97 years old.
Seems like a pretty good life.
Yes. So the whole time I was in his lab, and I saw, I was at the VA, and the VA is not the most meticulous hospital. He had these freezers full of stool samples of autism, Alzheimer's. He was just an amazing guy, right? And I was raised being afraid of microbes. My mom would sterilize everything. My mom would be like, it was a hospital, my house, right?
Where'd you grow up?
In Morocco.
Oh, in Morocco.
So in Morocco, in a world that's diverse microbes, here's my mom, like she would, have the maid do a complete sterile wash, and everything was basically very sterile environment. And when I moved to Montreal, I had a lot of allergies as a kid. And I think it's because of that sterility that my mom kept me in, right? That made me basically get some allergies. And what happens is over time, I started being more comfortable. But I had this, this thing with microbes. I would clean the counter, clean everything, even during COVID. But what I realized from Dr. Feingold, being in his lab, seeing that he lived till 97 is really, maybe there is something to playing with these microbes. Maybe there is something to exposing yourself little by little to all these microbes and developing that resilience, right? So when COVID hit, I was not scared anymore, and I took over my fear because I said, I'm just going to build up my immunity. I'm going to get exposed to them little by little, different strains every time, and I'm going to be fine. It was actually kind of funny because I was in Singapore, and this gentleman said to me, he said, wait, you've been exposed to all these strains and you're still here and you're still fine? And I said, yeah, I'm probably immune to all these strains. He goes, can I have your stools?
Yeah.
I said, not for sale, sorry. But immunity is something you build, right?
Yeah.
So immunity is that exposure. You're going to see your horses. You're exposed to I have a friend of mine who actually has a cancer, and she really believes that the reason she's still alive is because she's constantly exposed to her horses, and she goes back horseback riding, etc. And she's, so there is probably something to that, right? Where she's not so sterile, because I think we've killed and we need to bring back. And that's the mistake with chemo drugs right now, that I'm trying to get pharma to say, okay, it's not about just killing the tumor. It's about killing the tumor and optimizing the gut, because then you have success. Like COVID, treat the virus, kill the virus, boost the microbiome.
Could it, and I know this is a simplistic view, but it feels like when there's gut dysbiosis and, bifidobacteria gets low, diversity gets low, that it's almost like the weak link. Like you don't know what's going to happen. It could be cancer. It could be this. All this like cascade of these different like illnesses and sicknesses and diseases, whatever, like they become the environment, and which one hits you. I mean, for my son, it was type 1. For somebody else, it might be something else. And then it's almost like when you strengthen the immune system and you give it what it needs, it just tends to fix these things.
That's the hope, right? That's the hope. So you have to start at the beginning. What is happening? So what we discovered is with COVID really was this loss of bifidobacteria. But here's the thing. When we started looking at diseases like autism, loss of bifidobacteria is absent. There's no bifidobacteria in autistic children compared to healthy control. If you look at Lyme disease, loss of bifidobacteria in Lyme disease, Crohn's disease, loss of bifidobacteria in Crohn's, Alzheimer's, loss of bifidobacteria, invasive cancer, loss of bifidobacteria. Does it start with loss of bifidobacteria and then allows viruses and parasites to come in? And now there's no one to fight against those parasites. So yes, you can keep giving methylene blue, you can keep doing ozone therapy, you can do lavages and everything, but you're never really fixing the problem, which is the missing microbes. And the missing microbes it's very specific, because if you're missing a few, but you still have a few, you can grow those. That's your natural pool. So that's why in the future, yes, we're going to have a stool test that's basically going to tell us with precision the amount of bifidobacteria you have, for example. And then we're going to be able to tailor your treatment and say, okay, well, your bifidobacteria you've got some. Now you need A, B, C for treatment. You've got 0. Now you need ABC for treatment, because we need to give you probiotics to implant. That's why the question of probiotics, in my opinion, is kind of, it's a hard one because one, there's poor probiotics out there. Two, they're either not alive nor dead. Three, are you suppressing your own ability to make your own probiotics? You don't want to be dependent on anything. It's a great business model for anyone, but you don't, as a human being, you don't want to be dependent.
Have you found anybody that has low gut diversity and high bifidobacteria?
I'd have to look.
The fact that you don't know it off the top of your head?
I don't think so.
I don't think so.
I don't think so.
So, but you've had...
Wait. Yes. I'm sorry. Kids. Kids have low diversity and high bifidobacteria.
But you've looked at a lot of people that have good gut diversity, but no bifidobacteria.
Yes. So the process of aging is essentially loss of bifidobacteria. The diversity also kind of takes this curve that goes up and then down, right? So it starts down, up and down, kind of like a bell curve. And then, the bifidobacteria, if you're in that part of the curve and you have low diversity and low bifidobacteria, that's not a good thing. Yeah. But you could have high diversity and low bifidobacteria. I think there's been some people that have actually high diversity low diversity and high bifidobacteria, but those would be really rare in the older person. Yeah. I've only seen a few, the patients that have bifidobacteria, I've only seen a few older patients that have had a lot of bifidobacteria.
Were they much healthier than the...
Yeah, they were much healthier.
So if you're thinking about for longevity, being able
retaining your bifidobacteria could be a possibility.
So your hashtag of Save the Biff?
Save the Biff, yes.
So that hashtag Save the Biff, this is like if somebody were to... And I'm sure at some point in the future, you'll be able to kind of put a protocol together.
Yes.
That if you want to maintain your bifidobacteria over the course of your life, these are the things you need to do.
Yes, that's what I think.
That would give you the best outcome.
That's my theory. That's my hypothesis anyways. I think the longer you can retain your bifidobacteria, the longer you can live, in my opinion. But that's my opinion. Don't shoot the messenger.
It's also, there's other contributing factors for this. Are you healthy? Are you able to do these things? Like, are you able to, is the host healthy enough to be able to support this?
Yeah. Is your mind continuing to retain? There's so many factors. And the other factor that we don't talk about is really the colonic mucosa. Does the colonic mucosa diminish, ages, and therefore is not able to implant? So your colon, mucosal, the mucosa of the colon, the inside of your colon, where these microbes are sitting, essentially, does it become weak enough that it doesn't grab on these microbes? It doesn't allow them to stick.
So almost like receptors, it doesn't have the receptors.
Yeah. So it's a two-step process.
Is there a certain part of the body, so I remember from my nutrition science at Berkeley, they used to say that the window of the immune system was the small intestine.
Right.
So is it like when I think of the gut, it's really the whole thing from let's say from the esophagus all the way to to the colon. Is there one specific area that's more, I guess you could say, populated, or is it just kind of throughout so when they say gut biome?
I don't think we're there yet in the science. We are, monitoring. We're testing the stools at different locations in the bowels, etc. And there's some doctors out there that are doing the same. I don't think we're there to kind of to be certain, And a lot of this data, by the way, unfortunately, the methods out there for testing the microbiome are not necessarily the same. Think about space, and you don't know where Mars is, but you're kind of roaming around the Earth aimlessly because you don't know the exact location of Mars, right? And so, unfortunately, if you don't know the exact location of Mars, you're never going to go to Mars.
Yeah.
And so it's the same thing in the microbiome. If you're looking at the surface of the microbiome, you're not going to see anything. You have to really go to this area where you get a valid, verified, and reproducible result, right? And then once you've reached that result, then you can keep going back. And no matter what you do, unless you change your diet drastically or take antibiotics, you're going to see a change in that baseline. So, And unfortunately, a lot of labs out there are not using proper methods to go to that area. They don't, I honestly think a lot of them don't know.
Yeah.
And also the methods at which, they're going at it, right? So when you look at all the data on the microbiome, in my opinion, I was just reviewing a paper the other day where somebody said they found a certain signature microbiome in autoimmune disease, there was a whole bunch of diseases that they quoted, and they showed these microbes that were absent and present, right? Or actually lack of those microbes, right? Compared to control group. And I read that and I looked at my data because we have the biggest clinical data, out there. We're doing 61 clinical trials on the microbiome. So that's pretty significant. So we went back to that data and it was not reproducible. And I actually wrote to the reviewer of the art, as a reviewer to the journal, I said, not validated, poor methods, is completely contraindicate, would be dangerous to put out, because the problem is if you're showing me a group of microbes with a certain disease, then some other institution is going to believe your data and is going to say, oh, this is this bacteria. I need to zone in on this bacteria. I need to increase this bacteria. And then they spend millions of dollars on this bacteria. And then they realize, hey, it's not working. Why? Because you started off with an assay that was not valid, verified, and reproducible. And you got data on microbes that were not even the right microbes. For all I know, it could have been in the processing. It could have been the person, the lab technician, screwed up the samples and messed up or whatever. So if the research is not done properly on the microbiome and really meticulously done, you're never going to have good results to get to the next step. One of the things I insisted with my lab and my scientist, Andreas Papuzzi, is I said, I want an assay that is valid, verified, and reproducible. In other words, I want to see my signature microbiome of Sabine today, tomorrow, next month, next year, if I don't change anything and I just eat my regular food, right? And that's what he did. And to the point that somebody blocked the toilet. I joke at the conferences and I say this, somebody blocked the toilet in my house. I knew who the culprit was from their stool sample. So to me, that's a validated assay.
Yeah.
I can count on that and say, okay, you know what? Now that I'm coming out and I'm saying, autism have low bifidobacteria, I can trust that. Now, of course, the microbiome is going to change up and down, different meals. We're getting a glimpse into the microbiome of that kid. And then we do the data and then we get statistically significant or not. But here's the magic or the miracle in a way. When you see the cases of the two twins that are severely injured with autism, severely autistic, nonverbal, and their microbiome is this way, identically, the two of them have the same groups of microbes. And then you correct the microbiome and you flip that formula to becoming good microbes high, bad microbes down. And those kids are speaking and fully verbal, fully reading. That's the gold. Because now well, I have clinical significance, but I also have a microbiome assay that tells me that my kid has improved. When I was joking at the beginning of the pandemic, before COVID, when I was talking to Scott Jackson at National Institute of Standard, because they used to, all scientists, they're like, you need to be standardized. You need to have, I'm like, yes. But at the end of the day, unfortunately, I said, to understand the microbiome, you have to attain improvement. To attain improvement, you have to practice the art of medicine. So when you stop letting doctors be doctors and innovate and go with their guts on treatment, you're stopping the art of medicine. If you stop the art of medicine, you stop the understanding of the microbiome. So we need more cases like this. We need to reproduce these N of ones, these and showcase this engraftment, showcase that flipping of the microbiome to kind of say, okay, this is how this medication is helping. This is how it is safe to take. It is doing what it's doing, but also it's not decreasing the longevity of the patient. It's not decreasing, because here's the scary thing for me anyways, and the reason for Save the Biff. When you look at my stool samples before COVID and after COVID, there is a depletion in the microbiome. Whether it's from the virus itself, whether it's from things we gave for the virus, medications, whether it's from the stress, the solutions that were given for this virus, there is one thing that is for sure: decrease in Bifidobacteria is observed from the beginning to now. So my thought process, and if I'm right, and this is the way that autism is climbing, maybe what's happening is our kids are depleted slowly. And think about what we've done with our kids, from cell phones to mental anguish, to looking at social media, to, the Dr. Amen will say, the frontal lobes develop till 25 years old. And here we are putting our kids with these cell phones and social media, and we're influencing them. So is that all killing their microbiomes, as well as the foods we're giving them, as well as whatever else we're doing to them? So you think of that, and then you go, well, in New Jersey, the rate of autism is 1 in 33. And we are seeing a depletion of the microbiome.
Is there certain places that autism is more prevalent?
Well, New Jersey.
So it's bigger in New Jersey?
Yeah. New Jersey, 1 in 33. So when you see, and I work with a lot of clinics.
Like, because, growing up. Like let's say in 1975, was
1 in 10,000.
1 in 10,000.
Yeah.
And then that, where did it really come from? It was on this rise, and then was there a tipping point that we all of a sudden where it went from 1 in 10,000 to 1 in...
It went steadily, 1 in 10,000 to 1 in 44 to 1 in 33 in New Jersey. And here's my problem with that, is that what happens in 30 years from now? Is it going to be 1 in 1? Is 1 in 1 kid? And
that's what we talked about. 30 years from now, will there be a child born in this country that doesn't have autism?
Well, that's the problem. And also, as you see the increase, the disappearing microbes that I like to call the Bifidobacteria disappearance. I told you at the beginning, Bifidobacteria is important in helping us break down sugars. What happens when it disappears? Right? You're going to have increased ME/CFS, right? Because they're tired. And by the way, ME/CFS have lots of Bifidobacteria. So you're seeing that increase in autism. You're seeing that depletion of the microbiome. And you're also seeing increase in Alzheimer's, increase in cancer, increase in Parkinson's, increase in MS. I mean, diseases like glioblastoma, never heard of it before the pandemic. Now I must have a dozen kids with glioblastoma that we're testing the microbiome. So, and people, oncologists are noticing,
well, look at
colon cancer on the rise.
Look at non-alcoholic fatty liver disease.
Yeah.
That never existed before.
Correct.
Yeah.
And here's what happened with NASH, right? Because I'm actually friends with a lot of the doctors that are, working a lot on fatty liver. Was the fat that we were consuming back then pure and therefore not infected? And is the fat now infected with microbes, and therefore the fat is keeping those microbes, storage kind of thing, right? So I think that's going to be, we have to look at all that. So yeah, Save the Biff is my big platform, because that's going to be the future.
If people want to follow you on social media, how do they click on?
Dr. Sabine Hazan, or Sabine Hazan MD on X. Progenobiome really is where I'm at, and Dr. Sabine Hazan on Instagram.
Okay, we'll put everything in the show notes if you want to get a hold of her.
I don't have a Facebook page, so
which is
be
smart.
Careful, because there are scammers out there that are scamming people and pretending that there's that I'm charging clinics.
Yeah, we'll put the link to Progenobiome
perfect
in the show notes, and you guys can click on and contact her there. So
perfect. Doc, and support the Microbiome Research Foundation, because that's how. And
we'll also throw that in there too. Thank you. Doc, thanks so much for coming on Power Athlete Radio.
Thank you. So great.
Have a great day. See you.
You too.
Hey there, Power Athlete Nation. Big shout out to all the heavy hitters who stuck around till the final whistle. If you've been soaking in the knowledge bombs and epic tales we've been dropping for free, here's your chance to be a game changer. Swing by ko-fi.com/powerathlete and toss a few bucks our way to keep the podcast fueled and firing on all cylinders. That's ko-fi.com/powerathlete. Your support makes a difference. See ya.